Yo, what's going on, people? Leo here from Creative Tech Lab. Today we're going to talk about how to set up your Sony camera to shoot cinematic B-roll. Let's get into it. But first and foremost, welcome to Creative Tech Lab. This is probably your first time here, so big up yourself for clicking on this video. Good vibes with all the craziness that's going on out there. My name is Leo. This is Creative Tech Lab. We talk a lot about run and gun videography here on the channel, so if you're into that kind of thing, stick around, you might like it. And to the 2,700 people that have chosen to click the buttons down below and rock with us, big up, respect every single time. Anyway, recently I did a video on how to set up your cinematic settings on the A6400, and in that video I referenced 24 frames per second as my main frame rate, but I also utilize a lot of 120 frames per second and 60 frames per second, even 30 as my B-roll. I didn't go to how I quickly switch frame rates on my Sony Alpha camera, so that's what today's video is about. It's a quick follow-up to that video on how we set that up here. I'm actually about to do a quick workout just down here in the driveway, so I'm going to show you a quick example of the type of situation that I've been when I need to switch from 24 to 120 or 60 frames per second real quick. Let's go. So this would be a good example of what I'm talking about. Right now I'm just talking to you guys in 24 frames per second. Grab some B-roll real quick. I would do it in 120 or 60 frames per second. So we're going to snap the camera into the mode like I showed you before and get that done. All right, so back here in the office, that's kind of just a quick example. It wasn't the most quote unquote cinematic sequence, but you kind of get the idea. I was talking in real time and then I switched to 120 frames per second. So let me show you how I have that set up here on my camera. All right, so I'm shooting on the A7 III to shoot this video, but I'm demonstrating on the A6400. So let's kind of get into how it would work on these cameras and how I'm able to quickly change frame rates. What I use is my memory recall setting. So on the A6400, you have this MR button and you have 3 memory slots that you're able to choose there. On the A7 III, you actually have dedicated buttons, a memory slot 1 and memory slot 2, and then there's one other way to get one extra quote-unquote memory setting out of the camera that I'm going to show you guys here as well. So let's set it up here on the A6400, and then I'll show you what that looks like in the A7 III real quick. So everything here on my screen is my settings that I want there. My 24 frames per second, my shutter speed is set correctly. My picture profile is the one that I want. I set the ISO just at its lowest there, and I can always bump it up. Custom button for that. Link up here to set up your custom buttons on this camera if you need to do that. And then we're gonna come over to the first folder and go over to page 4, and you're gonna see this memory button here. You're gonna come in and you're gonna select memory 1 and it's gonna say registered. So now that's there. We're gonna repeat that 2 times for our other frame range that we want there. So come back over to set up our 120 frames per second, we gotta put the camera into HD. Select 120 frames at 100 megabits per second. And I'm going to come back out to my shutter speed to set that to 1/250 in order to set the correct shutter speed there. Keep all the other settings the same because my picture profile and all that there. And then I'm going to come back over to that memory page there in folder 1, page 4. And then I'm going to set that to memory recall 2, and that's registered. In my third slot on the A6400, I actually do 30 frames per second. And that's if I'm in a really dark situation, but I still want to possibly slow it down by 20%. 30 frames per second, I actually do that in 4K. So let's just shoot back over to that second folder, put the camera back into 4K, select 30 frames per second at 100 megabits per second. And then we're gonna set the shutter correctly to 1/60 for your 30 frames per second, double your frame rate. Then we're gonna register it there, go back over to folder 1, go to page 4, come down to the memory and register that into 3, and then you're registered there. So now my memory recall settings, if I stick the camera into MR, I have a 1, a 2, a 3, and you see all my different frame rates are set up there in the camera so I could choose which one I want. So similar to where I was there, 24 frames per second, I have the camera on vlogging. I quickly want to change. I actually just go like this on the dial, snap it out, snap it back into MR. It pulls up the screen there. I select the frames that I want, 1, 2, or 3, and I get to shooting. One more thing that I want to show you though, the last thing that I do to set this whole thing up and make sure I have all the popular frame rates that I'd want available to me is I stick the camera back into movie mode, and sometimes I might not want to do 120 frames per second because it might be too dark, and I might want to do 60 frames per second. I'll leave movie mode just set to 60 frames per second, and anytime I put the camera into movie mode, it'll be at 60 frames per second with this right shutter speed. So you actually get quote unquote an extra memory button because the camera is always going to remember that. So let's just set that up real quick. We're going to come back over to where we set our frame rates there, file format to HD, 60 frames per second is done at 50 megabits per second is the highest you could do it there. Set the shutter speed to 1/25 so we have the right shutter speed there, and then we're just going to leave the camera in that mode. Then if I want to shoot live action, I go to MR, I select what I want there. If I want to shoot 120 frames per second, I could just snap this, snap it back, select that, or 30 frames per second, same thing. And then if I want to do 60 frames per second, I just snap the camera into movie mode. It's already ready for that and it's ready to go there. And then as I mentioned, it's slightly different on the A7 III. The A7 III has memory buttons 1 and 2 actually on the dial as I'm showing here in the B-roll. So I have that set right now to my 4K 24 frames per second in 1, my 120 frames per second in memory slot 2. And then what I typically do there is just kind of choose in between whether I'm going to do 60 frames per second or 30 frames per second, depending on what I'm doing that particular day. I'll just set that in the movie mode there so I have those 3 buttons. So you kind of lose a memory setting there on the A7 III in comparison to some of the other Sony cameras, but it's one less keystroke that you have to do there because you just turn the dial and you're in the settings that you need to. So it's 6 of one, half a dozen on the other, and no way it's kind of set up. It's a little bit easier to use, but not as many memory settings there. One more thing I wanted to say, when I did set up the function buttons on the camera, that's another way that you could, if you change frame rates a lot while it is that you're shooting, you could either set your memory settings to one of your custom buttons there, you could map it to that, or you could map it to the function buttons here as I'm showing you here on the camera. Come into memory recall settings here, pull it up, it gives me a 1, 2, and 3 here, and I can select it here on the camera. So that's one more way to do it there. Anyway, no need to ramble on. That's how I have the camera set up for my cinematic settings in terms of switching frame rates when you're out running and gunning and you need to capture stuff at different frame rates there, particularly setting up slow motion. In this case, if this video helped you out in any way, shape, or form, please go ahead and drop it a like, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification button. We talk a lot about Sony cameras and filmmaking, video making tip with a lot more stuff in other creating disciplines to come, so you won't be disappointed. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you in the next video. Big up, peace.